So welcome to our sneak peek program. My name's Jane Lovino and I am the Sugden Family Curator of Education and Exhibits here at the museum. And these programs, some of you heard me say this, we typically do them as a way for our visitors to kind of see behind the scenes right before an exhibit opens to the public. And this one, in fact, opens tomorrow officially, but we will keep it open. Since we're so far ahead of ourselves, we won't scurry you out right afterwards. We have most of it done in this case. But like I said, it's an exhibit that encompasses 3 galleries. It starts in this room, the Gilcrease Gallery. It extends into Changing Visions Gallery, and then one more into what we call the Bison Gallery. And so you'll have a chance to see the wealth of wildlife on the plains. And we have a guest speaker in addition to myself, who I'll be introducing in just a moment. But let's see what else I wanted to say before we start here. Oh, I wanted to be sure to thank our exhibit sponsors, and they are the Friends of the National Museum of Wildlife Art in memory of David Carlin. So those are the sponsors of this exhibit, which is entitled Monarchs of the Plains. And I love that Adam Harris, our curator, who is not with us today, has decided to put this piece by Howland, is the artist, right as you walk in, because this piece by John Howland is one that I remember when I started working here years ago, when this museum was still located on the town square. This piece was part of that original collection, and its title is Monarch of the Plains. So when we think of Monarch of the Plains, we think of the big bison. And in fact, when you look around, you'll see there are quite a few paintings and sculptures of bison. But this exhibit goes beyond the typical monarch of the plains, which is the bison, to include pronghorn and prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets and wolves and even grizzly bears, which a lot of people don't realize was a plains animal, and it still occasionally can be seen on the plains. Yeah, if you just look around where you are, you start to see some of the richness of all the animals on the plains. But back to John Howland, I love that he's decided to depict this bison in the midst of a prairie dog colony or town, because that alludes to the fact that so many of these animals are connected to each other, and if something happens to one, then something happens to the other. And for there to be a rich ecosystem, you really need all of these different varieties of species. A little bit about John Howland. He knew what he was talking about when he did paintings like this one. He grew up on the East Coast, but at age 14, he knew he wanted to go west. So he went west and he joined the American Fur Company as a fur trader. And he spent lots of time trading with the Sioux Indian tribe on the Platte River and on the Missouri River. And so he definitely had a chance to see the bison in their natural habitat and see how they interacted with the prairie dogs, and I'm sure he saw the black-footed ferrets. While I'm thinking of it, there's a fabulous timeline on this curved wall over here. One of our great summer interns did all of the research for the text blurbs that you see, but the grass extends across. As you can see, it's not exactly spaced chronologically. You have 1600, 1700, 1800, then it jumps to 1900 down there. But there's a fabulous bits of information about, like, for example, this is one I was not at all aware of, that as early as 1630, a bounty on wolves was established in Massachusetts. That was just 10 years after Plymouth Colony was founded. So wolves started being picked on way back then and continue to have that. That's true today, of course. A lot of you are familiar with Yellowstone and how they were exterminated from Yellowstone and then reintroduced into Yellowstone. But there's some great facts over there. But I want you to take this image of John Howland's Monarch of the Plains with you. And we're going to get up and we're going to move to the third gallery, because I want to show a contemporary piece by a modern artist that's very different. Yes. And one thing I meant to mention to you about the organization of the exhibition is that it's roughly arranged chronologically. So we started with one of the older pieces in the collection, and then as you come through the other spaces, in this room you see some of the much more contemporary pieces by living artists. And so that's the thinking behind the arrangement. It is a chronology. But come all the way down here, and I want to show you one that relates to that first one we were looking at, but is but is a modern piece by an artist named Tom Palmore. So if you come down here to this corner and come around the corner, again, it's kind of tucked away, but this is a really, like I said, that piece we looked at by John Howland was one of the first pieces I remember when I started working here 24 years ago in the collection. This is a piece that was just acquired at our Western Visions show and sale a few weeks ago. So this is the other extreme, and I want to tell you a little bit about Tom Palmore. He's a living artist. The title of this piece is The King and Queen of Dogtown. So instead of Monarch of the Plains, he's making a play on that whole idea of who's the king and queen of the plains, and he shows them with these prairie dogs, and they're sitting up as if they are king and queen posing for their portrait, and he loves to juxtapose interesting, the animals with this interesting background. Often it's like wallpaper, or in this case you can see the drapery of the appropriate setting for the king and queen, a little reference to a potted plant in the corner. He has a fabulous sense of humor, and there's a great quote by him that I want to read to you. He says, "Artists are only as good as their willingness to let their personalities show in their work." And his personality definitely shows in this work here. He's always done his own thing. He's always stayed true to his own sense of humor and his own wit. And his pieces are shown all over. He's been very successful with these works of art. But I just love the contrast between that first Monarch of the Plains and this King and Queen of, I'm sure the title also is a reference to, some of you may have seen that film, The Boys of Dogtown. It was a skateboarding film a number of years ago. So he's you get a little sense of his personality and his wit with the title and with how he's decided to pose his king and queen. Another contemporary artist work that I want to point out while we're in here is, most of these works, I should say, are in our permanent collection. There are a few pieces on loan. So far we've only talked about 2 pieces from our permanent collection, but this is a beautiful painting by Katherine Turner that's on loan for this exhibit. There are a couple different pieces that are, and Katherine's with us today, so glad she could be with us. But I know that Adam Harris, our curator, really wanted this piece in the exhibit to provide a kind of a counterpoint to some of the more traditional stags, bulls posing in the landscape. And this is a much quieter piece of some cow elk. And Katherine has described her inspiration for this. She grew up at Triangle X Ranch, just north of here, and going out in the morning to round up the horses and bring them into the corral. And that early morning kind of misty fogginess that you see, and then the elk would kind of emerge and then disappear, and you get this much softer but very beautiful image of yet another monarch of the plains. Anything else to add to that, Katherine, since you're here? It's great to have you with us.
This is such a complete thrill to me, and it's a thrill because this museum has been such an important part of my growth as an artist since I was a little girl. So this is just beyond exciting for me. It's really a treat. But I'll mention the title of it, which is The Three Matriarchs, and I really just appreciate the role that the cow play in the herd, and the understanding of that they carry from generation to generation onto their offspring, and the role that they play in the herd. And that's this is my painting that appreciates them.
Nice.
I think cow elk are underappreciated in wildlife art.
I think you're right, because when you go through our collection, you don't see very many. You see a lot of the bull elk, but not many of the cows. Beautiful painting. Let's go through, we've looked at 2 recent paintings in here. We looked at one older. I want to look at one more older piece, more traditional piece. If you come straight through this way, sorry for all the movement. But this is a piece that I wanted to talk about a little bit because it is a piece that has been acquired very recently, and a lot of people who are familiar with our collection maybe don't know very much about this particular piece. So you can see it's called Buffalo Relief is the title. The artist of this piece is Charles Carey Rumsey. This was created in 1905. So again, to give you that counterpoint, this is one of the older pieces that's in the exhibition. And this artist, again, is similar in some ways to the first artist we talked about. He was someone who grew up always knowing he was interested in art, or interested in the West. And he, at age 14, he was on a trip to Paris with his parents. He grew up in this country. He'd taken a trip to Paris with his parents. He was only 14, and his parents decided to let him stay and study art in Paris because he had a chance to study with a well-known artist. I'm going to give you the name. Oh, Paul Bartlett was the well-known artist who was in Paris at the time. So he stayed there for 2 years, age 14, age 15, to perfect his skills as an artist. He came back to this country. He eventually did some studies at Harvard and at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And he did some really famous works of art, including there's a frieze on the Brooklyn Bridge of a buffalo hunt. If anybody here is from New York, you may have seen that and not known even that it was this artist, but it was a beautiful piece. And so this is one of the pieces that I love because it gives you a sense of where some of other works like this may have been seen, and it's been gathered then and coming into our museum. It's a really nice addition to our collection. What I'd like to do next is introduce our guest speaker, which we're really happy to have her with us. Our guest speaker is Katherine Thompson, and she is the Northwest Wyoming Program Director for the Nature Conservancy. She lives in Cody, Wyoming, and she's down here in Jackson just for a couple of days. She's a botanist and a fisheries scientist, but the majority of the work that she's now focused on is land and species protection. She's originally from Maine, is that correct? No. Not Michigan? Close. East Coast? Michigan, okay. The other M State. And so she's done research, she's done all kinds of different things, but I'm going to let her give you a different perspective on this exhibition, and you're going to hear, not so much about the artist, but more about the habitat and the wildlife species.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, thank you for having me today. I think what I would like to do is move us back to the first gallery here at the beginning of the exhibit. There's a map I would like to show to you first about the Great Plains. So if you'll walk this way. So the species that we're looking at today are those that at one point or another inhabited the Great Plains of the Americas. And when biologists talk about the Great Plains, we're referring to a broad expanse of flat land that's roughly in the middle of the country. It depends on who you ask, but the Great Plains are typically defined as their southern border is on the Rio Grande in Texas, and then they extend actually further up into Canada than is shown on this map, and they run roughly from the Rocky Mountains on their western edge over to the Mississippi. Although I think what we're looking at here, as a biologist, I would more define this map as encompassing the interior plains, and the Great Plains are a subset of that. It's roughly 500 miles east to west and 2,000 miles north to south, 500 to a million square miles, 500,000 to a million square miles, somewhere in there. And this area is flat because about somewhere between 55 and 65 million years ago, this area was covered by an enormous interior sea. And then when the sea began to recede, it left behind this relatively flat territory that then developed into a number of different types of ecosystems, from prairie to, some of those are sort of defined there. Tall grass prairie, short grass prairie, sagebrush steppe, and also what we typically think of as grassland, which is primarily grasses and sedges. And then after the sea receded, about 30 million years passed, and there was forests had emerged there, and all kinds of other habitats. And when the climate started to change, what was left were grasses, steppe, and sagebrush habitats. So let's talk about what the grasslands were like long before humans were impacting them. So until about 13,000 years ago, you would have seen creatures out on the Great Plains like American lions, giant sloths, mammoths, what else I'm forgetting a few, mastodon, saber-toothed cats. There was a native horse that actually was found here until about 13,000 years ago. When the Europeans arrived, of course, many of those species were already gone, but there were still about 35 million pronghorn antelope moving across the plains. Those evolved to run, you see them now, they can run 55 or 60 miles an hour for at least a stretch of time or distance. And they were very likely evolved to outrun the now extinct American cheetah, which is interesting to think about, because there's really nothing left, predator-wise, that can go nearly as fast for as long a distance as a pronghorn can. There were up to 1 billion prairie dogs living in enormous towns. So if we look over here, you can kind of get a sense of the scale of a prairie dog town, although obviously this doesn't encompass it. Prairie dog towns would have been stretched across sometimes hundreds of square miles of territory, hundreds of thousands of creatures in one town. There were also elk and mule deer, like we see today. And unbeknownst to most, if you turn around and look in the back here, the Great Plains were also habitat for grizzly bears. Okay, so there were grizzly bears all across the Great Plains. We only think of them now as animals that you see in the, sort of the rocky and icy places, the high mountainous forests, because that's where people have chased them to. So they're limited to those habitats now. One thing I wanted to point out here, and you'll see it when you look at especially the early images of the bison, this to me doesn't look much like a grizzly bear as we know it. If you look at the very long snout, what's one of the first things you read to identify a grizzly bear? It's got a dish-shaped face, it's sort of flattened. It's important to realize that many of the early artists had never seen these creatures before they tried to depict them, and sometimes that's obvious. To me, like in this one. We also see something similar, I'll turn back around, in this image of the bison, and I would encourage you to come and have a look at this one before you leave this gallery. This is an amazing image, early image of bison, and there were 30 to 60 million bison probably roaming through the Great Plains back before Europeans arrived in this country. And many early artists depicted bison, obviously not from personal experience, but from what they heard or possibly, other artists' images. And so a lot of times early images look to me more like a true buffalo. And I'll get to that, bison versus buffalo in a minute. A true buffalo, so creatures that are in Asia or Africa, like water buffalo. This, to me, actually looks more like a teddy bear, like a really fuzzy, friendly, happy teddy bear. So not exactly what we think of as bison, but so it's interesting to notice that. So let's talk about bison a little. A lot of this exhibit is about bison. There are 2 extant species or subspecies of bison, including the plains bison, which found in the Yellowstone region. So that's mostly what we're seeing depicted in this exhibit, are plains bison. They're a particular subspecies. 3 species of North American bison are already extinct. There's an extant species mostly in Canada called the woods bison that's very similar to the plains bison that's extant or still alive today. So the bison versus buffalo question. Bison, true bison are only distantly related to true buffalo, but because the words bison and buffalo, especially in different languages, roughly translate to mean ox-like, Both are considered correct in common usage, although it depends who you ask. Some biologists will be quite insistent that buffalo is not the proper term to use when referring to the creatures in the Yellowstone. So bison were found throughout the Great Plains. They were in the Rocky Mountains. They were across the Great Plains all the way west to the western Appalachian Mountains. They were found from southern Canada all the way south to northern Mexico. And as we know, these are massive creatures, right? And they ran in enormous herds. So they must have been incredibly impressive to see. A bull bison will stand about 6.5 feet tall at the shoulder and can weigh up to a ton. So they had significant impacts on their ecosystem, both because of individual animals, how massive they were, and because of the big herds that they ran in. In spite of the way that they look, these animals are incredibly agile. They can jump up to 6 feet high, if you can imagine that. I've never seen anything like that, but I would love to see it. They can long jump as well. They can jump up to 7 feet horizontally. So they can cross a lot of distance, as we see in the paper every time a tourist approaches them too closely and then learns their lesson and gets gored. They're powerful swimmers. We think of them as being sort of dull and mild-mannered, but they, as many of you know who live here, they actually can be quite aggressive. And the males will fight for dominance, which is something we're so lucky living in or visiting the Yellowstone region that we get to see in the park. So the males are fighting for dominance, and that's to basically have the privilege of being able to breed. And in some populations that have been studied closely, only 10% of the males in that population have been found to have done 50% of the breeding for that particular herd. So quite impressive, and dominance then imparts many biological benefits to that particular bison. The gestation period of a bison is 9.5 months, so very similar to humans, and then when the calves are born in the spring, they weigh between 30 and 40 pounds. And I actually had the privilege of getting to witness a bison calf being born in Yellowstone a few years ago. And there were, of course, a number of people gawking and watching what was happening and sort of placing informal bets on how long before this creature was able to get up and run. And it was not an hour after birth that calf was running. So they obviously were evolved with predators around. Although, we've done a trick on trying to eliminate those predators over time. Bison, as you can see here, they graze in very large herds, and they're typically female-led, and there'll be young males with the bison, with the females. When the males get old enough, about 4 years, they go off and they find they're typically smaller herds of males, and then they move around, and they fight for dominance. Some of them get to breed, and on it goes. So I want to move us now into the second gallery here. This is a very interesting painting of a member of a Plains Indian tribe with a bison calf walking alongside him. I can only hypothesize that the tribe had killed the calf's mother, and then the calf decided to follow this man home. So Plains Indian tribes, as many of you probably know, have inhabited the Great Plains for probably over 15,000 years, and there were many different tribes: the Blackfoot, the Crow, the Sioux, Cheyenne, a number of tribes. To many of those, bison played a very important role in their cultural heritage, and it's been very well documented that members of those tribes, they revered bison, and when they took bison through hunting, they tried to use every part of the bison. They used the hide and the fur for clothing and shelter. They made tools and weapons and other things out of the bones. They used the sinew for bows or other sorts of tools. And of course, they ate the meat. Now, white hunters, early hunters, in contrast to that, were very extravagant and wasteful. And this is an amazing series I would encourage you to take a close look at. Sort of depicting what happened to bison and why they declined over time in the 1800s. So this image shows, in my mind, and it's funny, as a biologist hearing Monarch of the Plains, my first thought was not about royalty. It was about monarch butterflies, which I realize now was silly, but I thought, oh, isn't that sort of a sad moniker, given that monarch butterflies are now steeply in decline and have very similar issues to these monarchs of the plains. So here you can see, what a herd of bison could have looked like, before Europeans arrived. And then in this next image, we see the railroads are moving through. So here we've got, 30 to 60 million bison across the plains. Here we show the railroads are moving through, and you can see shots going off as hunters on the railroad, on the train, are hunting bison, and they're trying to move them out of the way. After the railroads had moved through, this is an image of the hide hunters very efficiently removing hides, and the white shots up here are actually the hunters. There was a very systematized hunt at that point, and they're removing the hides and they're leaving almost everything else there to rot. Maybe they would also take the tongues. I mean, it was very, very wasteful. And then in the last image, I think this one is titled The End, if I remember correctly. Yeah. This one you see the bones, the bleaching bones out on the plains. And at this point, homesteaders would go out and try to get a little bit of value. They would collect the bones and send them east on the trains they were turned into fertilizer or into bone china or other things like that. So from a timeline perspective, this all happened really quickly, surprisingly quickly. So by 1832, commercial hunting was already rampant, and bison had been exterminated east of the Mississippi. And I didn't show it to you, but at the very beginning of the exhibit, you want to spend some time with this amazing map over there that shows how bison were exterminated over time and where their populations were. So 1832, bison disappear east of the Mississippi. By the mid to late 1800s, as the railroads are moving across the plains, the crews are impacting populations significantly. By 1870, in the year of 1870, it's estimated that 2 million bison were killed in 1 year, which is just amazing, and most of those were left to rot. Yellowstone Park was established in 1872, and it was partially established to provide refuge to the remaining bison, but they weren't protected inside the park even then, in spite of what people believe. So poachers continued to take animals out of the park for at least another 20 years, such that by 1888 there were only 541 bison left in the entire United States. And in 1894, I think that's 22 years after the park was established, the Lacey Act was passed, which finally allowed the soldiers who were in the park to prosecute poachers within its boundaries. And so poaching slowed, but not that quickly, so that by 1902 there were only 23 bison left in Yellowstone, and that was the largest remaining wild population of bison left south of Canada. So 23 bison were the original wild bison that started the conservation efforts. And then those efforts began to prevent the species from going extinct. There was captive breeding. They were managed in herds very much like domestic cattle, and that went on for years. They were fed, they were fenced in, they were moved to different, they weren't migrating anymore, but they were very much managed like cattle. But over time, it worked. Wild populations were allowed to migrate, they were moved, they were transported to different parts of the country, so that today there are about 350,000 plains bison alive in the U.S. And they live in both conservation and commercial herds across North America. But only 15,000 of those are on public lands. So the vast majority are in private herds. About 5,000 of those are in Yellowstone, and they mostly stay in the park, or a few of them are allowed to migrate into Montana. So they're basically ecologically extinct, if you know what that means. So they're no longer impacting the habitat the way that they would have. They aren't impacting nutrient cycling. They're not interacting with other species. They're not being preyed upon by predators and then providing other species with all the resources that would come from that. So yeah, I'm imagining that I'm at about taking up my time. So I want to open the floor to questions. There's a lot more I could say about bison, but I don't want to keep you too long.
Just one caveat, I was recently up in the northern Queen Charlotte Islands off British Columbia, and happened to read a publication from the Canadian government. They have been working on the woodland bison,
Yeah.
and they had released some. So obviously, there's the same sort of thought that we have here in the States
That's
to
right.
preserve that. And the last little note is my husband's grandfather was the head butcher for the Sioux line that went across the Dakotas along the line of Canada.
Wow.
And he had a gun that had 8 notches, and he had shot buffalo to feed the railroad crew.
Right, that's right. You know, I thank you for saying that, because that's actually, being from Cody, our own beloved Buffalo Bill Cody actually did something very similar. He used to be a hunter for the railroads to feed the crew, which is an interesting piece of history.
And he was a hide hunter, right? A very, very good one who could do 50, 60 skins a day.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
By himself.
He is such a Renaissance man. Are there other questions? I didn't even get into the issue of brucellosis, which I'm sure some of you are wondering about.
So bison are very large animals. They don't seem to be afraid of anything. What, in their day, what would eat them?
What would
attack
eat them?
Yeah.
Actually, wolves would eat them.
The small ones, probably, yeah.
Well, you know, and grizzly bears.
Yeah.
There is there are some records, I should say, that a single wolf occasionally would take down and kill a single bison. I mean, wolves are amazing hunters, but normally they would be hunted in packs. And the bison actually cooperate. They're unusual among ungulates in that they will cooperate to defend themselves. So they will herd up when they see wolves coming. But no, wolves, I mean, back in the day, it would have been, you know, lions probably, and cheetahs and saber-toothed cats. But grizzly bears will also take bison, even today. It's not typical because there's lots of other stuff on the landscape to eat that's easier to get.
Could you talk a little bit about their grazing patterns, since you're a botanist?
Yes.
What kind of effect that they have ecologically in with some of the other more minor species hidden in the plants?
Good question. So there is evidence that they consume, a single bison can consume up to 30 pounds of grass and sedges in a single day. And that seems to be what they prefer to eat, although they will eat woody plants. But there's evidence that, I mean, if you imagine 50 or 60 million of these things across the plains eating 30 pounds of grass a day, grass has evolved to be grazed the way that it's, you know, its strategies and the way that it flushes and all of that. It likes to be grazed. It's healthier. It has more protein in it when it's grazed. So they very likely maintained the grasslands by taking out woody species, either by trampling them or by eating them, by rubbing on them. So the grasslands very much went hand in hand with the bison, and having them removed from that ecosystem, there hasn't been a systematic effort to sort of determine from a scientific perspective what impact it's having, but it has to be enormous. So what we see in the grasslands today is probably much transformed from what it would have been when the bison were here.
Well, along those lines, the species relationship between the prairie dogs and the black-footed ferret being dependent on all of that entire dynamic, right? That we think of the almost extinction of the black-footed ferret being an independent issue when it's absolutely not.
Right, which is so ferrets are primarily predators of prairie dogs, and bison help keep habitat suitable for enormous prairie dog towns. And with the bison removed, there's fewer and fewer areas that are suitable for big prairie dog towns. I mean, there are all kinds of other reasons we don't have big prairie dog towns anymore. It's more than just removal of the bison, but still that's probably a significant impact. And then so ferrets, there isn't as much, they're the prey species that they need, and so she's right, it's all tied together.
When you mentioned that there were 3 species of bison that are extinct, you're reaching back into the archaeological record. You're not talking about separate species that were extant when...
That's right.
Okay, when
You're
people
right.
entered North America. Okay.
Yes,
just to be
sorry,
clear on
thank
that.
you for clarifying.
And then there's the European licent, which is
It's very closely related.
closely related.
That's right, yeah. Are there other questions for me?
Kathy, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
The last thing I'd like to do is invite you all who have attended this program down to the Rising Sage Cafe. They offer a 20% discount on lunch if you identify yourself as a sneak peek program attendee. So enjoy. Like I said, we won't be closing this down to keep working on it since we're so close to being ready to open it anyway. Take your time, look through, enjoy the rest of the museum. Other programs coming up in conjunction with this exhibit. We have a first Sunday in the first Sunday of November, where there will be some activities connected to this exhibit. And then we have a mixed media program coming up also in November with that was more targeted towards young adults, and it has some great program features as well. But check out our website for dates and times for both of those. Thanks.
And I am staying for lunch, and I would be so thrilled to talk with any of you more in the cafe. Thank you again.